Hi, I'm Clare Minahan. I'm an Associate Professor at Griffith University on the Gold Coast, Australia, and you're listening to the Physical Performance Show.
And the winner is...
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome back to the Physical Performance Show. I'm Brad Beer, sports and exercise physiotherapist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll bring you the latest and greatest highs, lows, and learnings with the intention to help you perform and pursue your own physical best performance. We do this across a range of different episodes, including featured performers, interest editions, coaches' corners, and expert editions. And on today's episode 179, get ready to learn on this an expert edition featuring Dr. Clare Monahan, PhD. Clare Monahan is an associate professor and accredited exercise physiologist residing at Griffith University Sports, Physiology and Performance Centre on the Gold Coast. Clare is a prolific researcher and sought-after expert when it comes to all things considerations for the female athlete. Clare consults with the Queensland Academy of Sport, Swimming Australia, the Gold Coast Suns AFL Football Club, and has worked with numerous world and national champion athletes. On this expert edition, Clare shares around the relative lack of knowledge regarding female athlete considerations. Clare shares around the potential effects of a female athlete's menstrual cycle, hormonal contraception, effective pregnancy on performance, injury and illness. Clare speaks about relative energy deficiency in sports for female athletes, key information for coaches and health professionals in working with the female athlete, and Clare outlines key performance strategies for getting the best performance as a female athlete. This is not to be missed regardless of your gender, so get ready to learn and enjoy from Dr. Clare Monahan on this an expert edition. Clare Monahan, Associate Professor, PhD at Griffith University on all things sports physiology and performance. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thanks very much for having me, Brad. It's a pleasure to be here.
Clare, I myself went through Griffith University many years ago, and you were always a bit of a shining light in the physiology world, and certainly someone that I would have expected to have the trajectory that you've had. But to put listeners of the show in context of your professional work in life, how do you spend a typical week?
Well, that's a really difficult question for an academic, and I guess that's what attracted me to the profession of academia, and that is because it does change so much. On a balanced profile, an academic does some face-to-face teaching, and these days some of that's online, and we also fit quite a bit of research into that week, and of course then we are involved in a whole lot of administration and community work, and that includes the university and also in the broader community with professional teams and local teams. So it's a mixture, and it changes every week.
And some of the teams that you're currently involved with, Clare, what are you currently contributing towards?
Yeah, so it sort of begins with your Olympic athletes at the Queensland Academy of Sports in a variety of different sports, one of which is swimming that we work closely with. And then to your professional teams, some of the football codes, including soccer for us in Australia here, and Australian rules football, as well as rugby league. That is both male and female teams where they're both available. Then, some down to your sort of club level, and there's a range of sports at that level that we work with.
And is there a sport, Clare, that's close to your heart?
Look, I don't think you can go past track and field in terms of conjuring up emotion when you watch those things at the Olympics. But more, I guess, week to week would be Australian rules football. I'm a Melburnian, and you just can't take it out of Melburnians.
And Claire, you yourself, you've always been active. When I think of Claire, I always think of strength and conditioning. What's your background sporting-wise entailed, Claire?
Yeah, it's fairly broad, particularly as a youngster. Hockey, athletics were my two major sports, but played everything under the sun. But you're right, I do have a passion for strength and conditioning. My great-grandfather was the strongest man in Australia at one point, and I do look back on him with, some pretty good fondness, and I've kept in that tradition and kept those genes going along and love to be in the gym.
Did he used to do some Turkish get-ups with a young Claire?
I'm sure he did. I never met him. He was my great grandfather, unfortunately. But it's funny looking back the history of strength and conditioning, and some of the names that pop up are the guys that he used to wrestle. So it's quite exciting to read that literature.
Rich bloodline. Well, Claire, the deep dive we wanted to do today is on all things considerations for the female athlete. So, speaking broadly initially, why does this matter? Well,
it matters because women make up 50% of the population. And I think largely we've ignored that. And that hasn't allowed women to reach their potential because of the contribution that science makes to performance. So I think it's about time that we spend some of our scientific knowledge and inquiry into women so that women can achieve at the highest level. And I'm not just talking about performance, I'm talking about recovery, training adaptations, and perhaps most importantly, before we get to that performance, is the health of the female athlete and the well-being of the female athlete.
Yeah, gosh, some really great sub-points there: recovery, performance, training adaptations, and obviously, first and foremost, the health of the athlete. Claire, you mentioned that it's been ignored. What do you think are the underpinning drivers there for research into women's health performance not having been fully arrived at?
It's a very good question. I think a lot of research in sports science is performed by men, and so naturally they're attracted to having male participants. And male participants perhaps are more likely, given that they would volunteer to be part of a sports science research study. And I've experienced that firsthand. So there's some small areas which may influence why there's more male research in sports science. But also I think with the varying hormonal profile of women from month to month, that makes the physiological response to any exercise stimulus more complex. And we're trying to control things in sports science, and when we lose control, we find it quite difficult. And so perhaps that's why we tend to use men as participants.
Yeah, and certainly in the world of rigorous scientific exploration, controlling variables is so important. So that would make sense. Claire, well, should we go there now? The varying hormonal profile of women and the response to exercise. Can you share a little on what does happen with that for the female athlete?
A normal menstrual cycle, so that is an athlete that's reached an age of which they've begun menarche and have a regular menstrual cycle, and we would call that normal. But it's less common than you think, actually. But if we call normal a regular menstrual cycle, that is having a period about every 28 days and fluctuations in the ovarian hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Now, they fluctuate throughout the 28 days, but we can divide that month up to in three parts generally. One called the follicular phase, in which hormones are low, that is progesterone and estrogen are considered low. And then ovulation, where progesterone remains relatively low, but we have a peak in estrogen. And then we go through the luteal phase where progesterone is elevated and estrogen somewhat as well. But you can see that the balance between progesterone and estrogen would create very different hormonal profiles through that month. And those hormones have an effect on physiology. And when we talk about physiology, and that is physiology that relates to performance perhaps, we can think about primary physiology characteristics. So aerobic metabolism, for instance, aerobic metabolism being dependent on or VO2 peak, efficiency, so the anaerobic threshold. Perhaps what also can affect aerobic metabolism is thermoregulation, energy availability. And then you move sort of to anaerobic metabolism. What is the peak rate of anaerobic metabolism? Is that affected by ovarian hormones? Is buffering capacity affected by ovarian hormones? And therefore, can we produce a lot of anaerobic metabolism without reaching fatigue? And then finally, force production, neural excitation, activation, rate of force development, for instance. And of course, if you look at recovery, how does ovarian hormones affect muscle damage? So that's me rattling off a few things that come to mind. And there's certainly been a lot more than that where ovarian hormones might play a role in altering the response to exercise.
And Claire, what jumps out to me there is whether you're maybe a power-based athlete or anaerobic athlete of some kind or an endurance athlete, your cycle is going to affect your physiology.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So aerobic metabolism relates to endurance, for instance. So you might be talking about time to exhaustion. You might be talking about performance in field testing, such as a 30-15 or a beep test. What we don't know, what step we haven't taken yet is the direct effect of ovarian hormones on performance. So I can tell you something about the primary physiology, but I can't tell you much about the actual performance. And by that I mean, does menstrual cycle affect marathon performance? Does the menstrual cycle affect a 1,500-metre swimming performance? That's the step we haven't taken yet, but we can work backwards to primary physiology and hypothesise about how menstrual cycle alterations or variations in ovarian hormones might affect performance.
And is that missing link, Claire, with science around performance or validated science? Is that just the complexity of conducting a research study that would assess or predict that, or what? Yeah,
that's exactly right. And I think menstrual cycle might affect physiology, and we know that it does in some instances, but the range of physiology that it does affect is quite broad. But it could also affect wellness and cognitive function. And the combination of those three things, the physiology, the cognitive function, the well-being of an individual, is very difficult to control. So the number of athletes we would have to try to control and measure. And then, of course, you've got environmental influences that would affect performance. Is very difficult to take that next step. But I think with the number of academics now focusing on female performance and menstrual cycle, we're going to start to see some movement in this space and get some answers.
Brilliant. Claire, you said something that jumped out, and that was that a inverted commas normal menstrual cycle is less common than you think. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so we probably have a significant amount of athletes with a condition called amenorrhea, that is the absence of their period, which would not be a normal menstrual cycle. And that can be up to sort of 20% in elite distance runners and or swimmers. So that's a significant amount of athletes, and they have to be of significant level. But there's another feature of the menstrual cycle, that is the luteal phase, which can be altered without notice to athletes or females. And that's when the luteal phase is inadequate. You would still have a period, but you wouldn't be ovulating. And that can happen up to 25% of females without them even knowing. And that would change then the hormonal profile of the menstrual cycle for those females.
So interesting, the luteal phase without notice to the athlete. So they're menstruating but not ovulating. What are the health concerns or the things that a female athlete, if that is detected, I'm not sure how it's detected, but why is that I should say, Claire, important?
Because the first thing that comes to mind is one might assume that a lack of ovulation could be a lack in an estrogen peak and therefore a decrease in circulating estrogen. In young women, this could be of concern, particularly because estrogen helps absorb calcium, and this is important, obviously, for bone density, particularly in young athletes, those who are perhaps of sports that are considered aesthetic sports where a low body fat is desirable, in distance sports where they're consuming a lot of energy and perhaps have low energy availability. This can be of concern, and the thing that does come to mind is their bone health.
And that is such an important consideration, obviously, for the young developing endurance athlete in terms of future health profile. And Claire, is there any way for an athlete to know that they may be menstruating but not ovulating, tests, etc.?
You might be aware of the pregnancy tests that some women do when they're trying to get pregnant that can often signal a dysfunctional menstrual cycle. But I think women should be much more aware of their menstrual cycle and how regular it is, how they feel during their menstrual cycle. And this needs to be a conversation that they have with their general practitioner, and it needs to happen frequently. Quite often, girls talk to their GP when they first reach menarche and then don't talk about it, perhaps until they either consider going on oral contraception or becoming pregnant. And again, then after that, the discussion tends to dwindle a little. So I think a conversation with the general practitioner, particularly if they're an elite athlete, should be a regular conversation.
Okay, so communicating more, talking more, and certainly as a health professional, a sports physio, I feel like it's something I need to improve on and on the search for better tools, etc., to allow me to be more effective with that population, female athletes. Do you see that as a concern from your vantage point, Claire, that practitioners in the field need to be upskilled in this area?
I do. We recently conducted a study where we asked athletes what they knew about menstrual cycle and what they knew about oral contraception. And the results were quite astounding. It's actually featuring in the e-edition of BJSM at the moment. The message is that very few athletes understand their menstrual cycle and understand how physiology might change with the administration of oral contraception. The fact that the athletes don't know much means that the practitioners aren't conveying any message about information on menstrual cycle and oral contraception. So I think both parties need to do a better job, one of asking questions and one of imparting knowledge.
Yeah, certainly. And I every week am confronted with a bone stress injury, often in an endurance athlete, and it's certainly something that I'm aware of how important this information is in terms of being able to best assess a female athlete that's presenting with a bone stress injury. So Claire, when is that e-edition of the BJSM out yet, or is that still in public, still to be printed?
Yep, the e-edition is absolutely out, and it is a female athlete edition, so there's lots of useful information in there. And we have an infographic. The actual manuscript isn't published yet, but there's some summary information there that could be quite useful.
And if there are practitioners listening in, Claire, what would be your quick couple of bullet point takeaways for them?
One, if we're talking about female athletes and young female athletes in particular, regardless of whether they have any symptoms, regardless if they present with an injury, I think a discussion needs to occur between the athlete and the practitioner regarding menstrual cycle, what is deemed a normal menstrual cycle, and perhaps start to monitor or encourage the athlete to start to monitor their menstrual cycle with the intention of following up in the near future to have a discussion around it.
Okay, brilliant. And are there, I presume there's probably apps now to monitor this, or a good old paper diary? What would you suggest?
Absolutely. There are several apps. I don't have one in particular that I want to advertise at the moment. There's pros and cons of many of them.
Yep.
A lot of elite athletes who would be part of a team would have access to athlete monitoring systems. And so I think it's important to put the information on a platform that can be shared amongst practitioners, but that can also be viewed with the consideration of training loads and other health information.
Okay, noted. Claire, you use the term amenorrhea, the absence of period. You commented that 20% of elite athletes, distance runners, or thereabouts, may be experiencing an absence of their period. Can you please paint a bit more of a picture around what leads to this and what it means for the female athlete in terms of their next steps in trying to, I guess, improve their health status?
Yeah, sure. So there's two types of amenorrhea. One is primary amenorrhea, which means around the age of 12 and a half is when girls generally begin their first period or have their first period. If that hasn't occurred by 15 years of age, then an athlete or a girl might be considered to have amenorrhea. So that means that they haven't begun, or they haven't reached menarche yet. They haven't begun their period. Regular amenorrhea is when they have had their period, but there's been now a disappearance of that period. And that may occur, and there may be different reasons for it. But in the case of an elite athlete, the risk is that the disappearance of a period may be due to low energy availability. So not necessarily the load of training or activity that they're doing, but in conjunction that they have an energy deficit. Now, this doesn't have to mean that they have disordered eating, as we once thought it may have something to do with that. The relative energy deficiency in sport, REDS as we know it now, it used to be called the female athlete triad. It's considered independently, and it's a syndrome that we can identify by menstrual disturbances, and that's just one way. But the relationship between a menstrual disturbance and energy deficit can then lead to problems with bone health. And those three things have typically been associated with the female triad.
And just to be clear, the female athlete triad, the contemporary sort of term is relative energy deficiency syndrome. Is that correct, Claire?
Absolutely, yep.
I know as a practitioner in the field that there's, the IOC / British Journal of Sports Medicine have the clinical assessment tool for that, which I find very helpful to use. And Claire, the energy availability, it's interesting. I thought I understood it well, and then as I dug a bit deeper, I realised there was a lot more to it. How does that happen in a young developing athlete? I mean, the common sense thought is you train, you're hungry, you eat, and if you're not putting on weight, therefore your energy output must be equal in input. But that's not the full picture, is it?
No, definitely isn't. And the other interesting part of that story is that performance may not be affected immediately either. So an athlete may think they're consuming the right amount of food. Their weight isn't changing, their performance isn't changing, but they can still be in a state of low energy deficit. And what happens is that other functions of the body shut down to conserve energy. And one of those functions is the menstrual cycle.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess another one is bone health.
Yeah, so that's that is a outcome of the disappearance of the menstrual cycle, or the increase in circulating estrogen, if you like. So with a decrease in circulating estrogen, we absorb less calcium, and therefore we have to get the calcium from our bones, which then directly affects bone health.
And so if we have female athletes listening in, Claire, whether they're recreationally competitive, heading towards the pointy end of performance, or elite full-time athletes, and they're concerned hearing this, that my body weight's stable, I think I do a good job of fueling myself, but now I'm concerned, maybe I have had some menstrual irregularities. What should they do next in terms of getting some understanding of whether they may be in an energy availability lack or deficit?
I think you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned the word concerned, and anyone who is concerned for any reason about their health or well-being should head to their general practitioner. In this case, there would be reason for concern if their menstrual cycle had become irregular. It is an exceptional tool to provide information about your physiology and your health. And so the general practitioner would be a first point of call. We know that general practitioners may not have all the answers regarding athletes and menstrual cycle. And so a sports dietitian might also be very helpful. I think there needs to be more encouragement for general practitioners to refer their athlete patients to endocrinologists with a special interest in female athletes, particularly if there's a little bit of concern from the general practitioner, or that the athlete is at that elite level and needs close monitoring.
So it has to be in many cases a multidisciplinary approach for best outcomes.
I would absolutely suggest that, yes.
Okay. And Claire, amenorrhea, we've discussed the primary and secondary categories of that. If we link this back now to the performance of the athlete, so let's come up with a case study here, a recreational runner who wants to pursue their first marathon, the bucket list marathon. They're giving themselves plenty of work-up time, Claire. They're not trying to cram it. They've taken a 1 to 2 year view to be ready for the event, so their training loads are progressively building. However, they notice that their menstrual cycle becomes irregular and they skip 1 month. Should they be concerned? What should they do?
I'm going to assume that this is a individual in their mid-20s.
Okay.
Perhaps a female that's reached peak bone mass already, so we're not too concerned that they haven't already reached peak bone mass. There's been an increase in training load with no change, let's suppose, in their dietary intake or the calories that they're intaking. So they're in energy deficit at the moment, and as a result of that, they've had some changes to their menstrual cycle. Menstrual cycle can disappear for lots of different reasons, and it may not be directly as a result of low energy availability over a short period of time. Again, if there's any concern, they should go and see their general practitioner. They may also choose to wait another month to see if this is a continuing problem. And if it is, then perhaps to see their general practitioner or dietitian. Dietitian would be a good suggestion. But what I do want to say also is your best marathon runners are probably in this same situation. And so it needs to be management, again, of health. And once health has been considered, we need to put this into perspective. A marathon runner is a very thin, lean build. And whether or not elite performance can be achieved without some disturbance in menstrual cycle is also a question we need to ask ourselves. Paula Radcliffe, we all know, is an exceptional marathon runner. There was a case study presented whereby she would go into energy deficit and then back into balance in a periodized way across a 4-year period. And of course, she achieved optimal performance by monitoring and periodizing her energy availability. And with that, some time with menstrual cycle disturbance, but the majority of time with menstrual cycle function, if you like. So I think for the recreational athlete, they should pay a lot of attention to their menstrual cycle leading into the training. If there is some disturbance, perhaps waiting another month. If there is any concern, they should go and see their general practitioner.
Well stated, Claire. I've written down, pay attention leading in, be prepared to give it the extra month just to see if things do return to typical, and if in doubt, get it checked out, see a health professional, a GP as a first point of call. Thank you for sharing that. Claire, is it possible, and it sounds like it is, but elite sporting endurance performance for females, it seems to be possible that elite female endurance athletes can maintain a cycle, or is it not achievable? It's seasonal, etc. You use Paula Radcliffe as an example there.
Look, it's absolutely achievable. I would suspect that possibly half of elite marathon runners or elite distance athletes have a regular menstrual cycle, but for some this is not possible. And so it's definitely an individual thing that, again, needs to be monitored by the athlete and managed by practitioners and the coach. But, yeah, absolutely possible. And that, again, is a sign of health and well-functioning physiology. So something perhaps that more elite female athletes should be looking to improve, and that is their menstrual function.
You're listening to Associate Professor Clare Minahan on this, an expert edition on all things considerations of the female athlete. Support for today's show comes from PhysioCreme. PhysioCreme is a topical massage cream containing natural plant-based ingredients, ideal for the temporary relief of muscular aches and pains. If you're conscious of what you put on your body, you'll be happy to know that PhysioCreme does not contain parabens or hydroxybenzoates, and its non-greasy formula doesn't leave any sticky residue behind. PhysioCreme can be found Australia-wide at your local Coles, chemist or health store, as well as via their online shop. PhysioCreme have generously offered listeners of the Physical Performance Show 20% off any product available online. Jump over to physiocreme.com.au, physiocrem.com.au to redeem this offer. And remember, hurting sucks. PhysioCreme have got your back. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio. We exist to help you get back to your physical best following injury. We want everyone who walks through the doors of Pogo Physio to complete their rehabilitation, get back to their physical best, and in doing so, cross their physio finish line. To find out more about Pogo Physio's award-winning services, including our telehealth consultations, which allows for physiotherapy services to be provided worldwide through technology, jump over to pogophysio.com.au. For now, let's jump back on this, an expert edition with Associate Professor, PhD Clare Monahan on all things considerations for the female athlete. Claire, we see a lot of, say we stay on this endurance performance theme, elite female athletes who head off to have children, start a family, and then return. And one of my observations is many times they return performing better postpartum. Any science that you can speak to there, Claire, in terms of the changes to a female athlete's body postpartum returning to sporting endeavours?
I'm not aware of anything in particular.
Okay.
It could be a whole host of reasons. One is training age. Regardless of athletes having had pregnancy and then the birth of a child, they still tend to train right up until 8 months. And so it may just be the accumulation of more training. The other thing is they've had some time to recover, so they might spend 2 weeks not running, which can be quite helpful in recovering an athlete. There doesn't seem to be any good relationship between changes in physiology or hormones regarding performance in athletes that have had children. May have something to do with the fact that they like to get out and about a little bit more and use training to clear the head, shall we say, but nothing that I'm aware of that directly relates to an improvement in performance after having children.
Okay, perhaps it's just that greater reason to push themselves when they're representing more than just themselves.
Yeah, that's absolutely possible.
Claire, you referenced disordered eating, and that at one point the thought was that energy deficit or a lack of energy availability existed in the environment of disordered eating. However, thinking and understanding has since progressed. So can you share around disordered eating, what that term means and what things to look for, and then furthermore the implications of disordered eating, not only on health but performance for the female athlete?
Yeah, so disordered eating specifically refers to an individual who perhaps controls their diet a little more than is required, and by that I mean the caloric intake as well as what types of food they allow themselves to have or not have. An individual that becomes obsessive about food, that restricts food groups, and that has perhaps a fear of consuming too many calories. So while we once thought, as you said, disordered eating was part of the female athlete triad, it certainly doesn't have to be. And it's really just low energy availability, as we've already spoken about. Disordered eating tends to occur in those aesthetic sports, that is diving, gymnastics, for example, but also in endurance sports and those that require particular body weights, such as lightweight rowing, some boxing categories, other fighting categories, for instance, where you have to reach a certain weight. So not just energy or low energy availability, but certainly disordered eating is a problem. And again, we look to see how that might affect health, well-being and performance. And it can affect all of these three things in athletes.
Health, well-being and performance, yeah. So it is multifactorial in terms of its effects. Claire, I heard a colleague of yours based from Canada there, Trent Stellingworth, reference on the aesthetic sports that you just mentioned, where there may be a higher incidence or prevalence of disordered eating, that sometimes, or there was a paper I believe you referenced in a conversation where they looked at rhythmic gymnasts compared with traditional gymnasts, I guess might be the term, distance runners and another group, and they were looking at their energy availability and their body composition. And surprisingly, the athletes who had the highest body fat were the ones that were actually in energy deficit as opposed to energy surplus. So what changes, if I've got that right, is that possible, and what changes are happening to the metabolism of the athlete that is in a period of ongoing energy deficit, such as an endurance athlete or a gymnast?
I'm not across that particular finding, actually. And I guess one message might be that if an athlete is in low energy availability or in disordered eating, that perhaps not only are they losing muscle fat, but they're also losing they're losing body fat, but they're going to be losing skeletal muscle as well. And so that would change their body composition, whereby they would get increases in percentage body fat. And I think that was the finding rather than an absolute value. And that is a direct result of losing skeletal muscle and an athlete not consuming enough protein to be able to support muscle growth.
And the takeaway I took was we can't look at an athlete and just assume we know what their energy status is like based on their appearance.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. If an athlete had a greater percentage of body fat, it doesn't mean that they're not in an energy deficit state.
Clare, coaching, the art and science of coaching, coaches are informed by academics in the field like yourself and obviously their own, in many cases, decades of experience. What advice or encouragement could you give to coaches in terms of, as we started this conversation, you said it's about, females, no matter what the level, being able to optimise or explore their full potential. So what encouragement, advice might you give to coaches tuning in to help their female athletes? I know it's a broad question.
Yeah, it is. I guess if we narrow it down to menstrual cycle to begin with, I think we need to encourage coaches not to be afraid of that discussion with their athletes, and if it needs to be with parents, if they're at a level in which menstrual cycle might affect their performance, it has to be a discussion that's got to have. And I think if we do that right from the start and establish that it's a very normal part of physiology, and one that may affect health and well-being and performance, then it becomes normal for the athlete. And so just an encouragement that a conversation is important around that. And then, of course, the female athlete triad or REDS, again, to be very aware of the symptoms, to discuss them early with your athletes, and encourage athletes not to be afraid to have that conversation with them, and putting things in place that doesn't always require an athlete to come to the coach, but that there are some regular screening measures that could be put into a long training schedule, if you like, that just check up on the female athlete. So again, becomes part of training, not something that they always have to go to the coach and say, look, I'm not feeling that great, or, I haven't had my period for a while. I think it should be a normal part of screening, and a coach should be encouraged to put that in, for boys and for girls.
Yeah, so I've jotted down there, have things in place, maybe feedback mechanisms, screening protocols, so that it doesn't require the athlete to perhaps vulnerably feel like they need to go up and, if they're not quite comfortable, they haven't yet arrived with that open communication to share it. And secondly, for the coach to be aware of the female athlete triad or REDS, RED-S, and also for the coach not to be afraid of the discussion. Claire, if we can just get practical for a moment, what questions might a coach ask? So they're listening and going, okay, great, I want to make a more concerted effort. What questions might they practically ask? How might that conversation initially commence?
Yeah, I think if they had access to an athlete management system, that would be the first point of call. So the athlete doesn't feel like they're communicating directly with the coach all of the time, but that there is that middleman, if you like. And so regular screening. One is just a monitoring tool, so the coach knows where they are in their menstrual cycle. Questions such as mood states, any other menstrual symptoms, helps a coach know whether these are regular occurrences or whether they're out of the ordinary. So, and these can be part of every day, as they might take a resting heart rate. They're also asking the question, how do you feel today? How are your energy levels? And a third question might be, what day of the menstrual cycle are you on? If an athlete says, I don't know or I don't get it, then obviously there's a red flag straight away. Keeping a food diary also gives the coach some clues as to whether or not the athlete is consuming enough of the right type of food, whether they're restricting some food groups for any particular reason. So getting, again, the athletes regularly monitoring what they're doing, and a coach asking for that information on a regular basis, perhaps every 2 weeks, 4 weeks, or even 6 weeks might be good enough to be able to pick up any red flags.
Oh, Claire, that's such practical and great advice. Thank you. And in terms of knowing the symptoms of the female athlete triad, or RED-S in its contemporary terminology, what are the symptoms that a coach or a parent, perhaps of a junior athlete, needs to be aware of?
Yeah, so a decrease in performance is always a red flag for a coach and for an athlete, because that's what they're there for. But that it's not necessarily a result of the female athlete triad or red S. And so we've got to look for some other red flags. And that's why the menstrual cycle is so valuable, because it gives us a lot of information about our health. And so the disappearance of menstrual cycle, some irregularities in menstrual cycle require further investigation. That's absolutely for sure. Other things that might cause for a red flag are changes in immune function. So continually getting upper respiratory tract infections can also require further investigation and might simply be a symptom of red S. As you mentioned at the start, you have athletes coming in with sore feet, small fractures, those kinds of things. And, of course, one thing that should be investigated is the potential for low energy availability.
Yeah, great. And that's something that, most, endurance athletes will often have to deal with throughout a career is a bone stress injury. So taking those things in the broader context of their cycle can help them determine it. And obviously, if you're a coach or a parent, be on the lookout for those things as well. Claire, there's two final things that I feel might be useful to wrestle to the ground. You said at the start that this is about physiology, well-being and cognitive function. Cognitively, how does a female's cycle, if you like, affect their cognitive function, or may it?
It would affect it in different ways. One acute effect might be as a result of the administration of oral contraception, which for some individuals can affect their mood, and for some can induce anxiousness, can induce depression. And so, again, if there's any concern, there certainly needs to be further investigation. But it may also be just a result of the physical symptoms. So if an athlete feels bloated or tired or has irregular symptoms or a heavy period, that might also provide them with a reason to feel anxious. And so it can either be a direct effect or it can be a secondary effect while some of the physical symptoms cause them to not concentrate or feel anxious, if you like. Change their confidence, change the orientation of what their goals might be at the time.
And I think once again, from anyone involved with athletes, it's I think just invaluable information to be aware that, indirect or direct effects may be had. You're listening to Associate Professor Clare Minahan on this, an expert edition of the Physical Performance Show on all things considerations for the female athlete. If you missed last week's episode featuring Director of Performance Solutions for the Canadian Sports Institute, Trent Stellingworth, then here's a little snippet of Trent sharing around all things fueling for the endurance athlete.
And that's the tricky bit with REDS, is that in many instances, it's non-purposeful. You're just unaware. Secondly, it can be just 300 or 400 calories. And on the individual level, the methodologies that we have for energy intake, I don't care who you are, it is really challenging to measure energy intake and energy expenditure to within 300 or 400 calories. The methods aren't there unless you're in a metabolic ward or you're using very expensive tracers. There's just too much noise to measure that. Yet, that amount of calories multiplied by 365 is just over 100,000 calories or a month of eating.
To learn from and enjoy the full episode, be sure to jump over to iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever it is that you enjoy this podcast from. And whilst there, explore the archives, including featured performers, expert editions, interest editions, and coaches' corners. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured expert edition, Associate Professor Clare Monahan. Claire, the other topic that I thought was just worthy of briefly exploring was the male athlete. Now, I know this is about the female athlete considerations. One thing that I guess I've personally experienced in being diagnosed with low bone mineral density in my mid-30s was that this is something that we need to keep an eye on for male athletes as well, correct? I mean, obviously we're not dealing with the menstrual cycle, but energy availability is still an important conversation point for the male athlete?
You're absolutely right. I think where the menstrual cycle fits in is it's such a wonderful measure, if you like, of physiology and health. And so it allows us to identify that perhaps something requires further investigation. Men, boys don't have that being able to identify if something is perhaps amiss with energy availability. But certainly there might be some other signs and symptoms and red flags, such as changes in immune function, changes in cognitive anxiety that might red flag and lead to some investigation around energy availability. But you're quite right. The occurrence is significant in boys and male athletes as well.
Yeah, so fantastic just to be aware of that for anyone in the field or looking to perform at your own best. Clare, you've shared so much and so well. This is a very difficult question, particularly for an academic. I think it must be almost a mild form of torture. But if you had to boil everything that you've learnt through your extensive and ongoing professional career in your field down to one piece of advice to help the listeners of this show perform at their physical best, what would that solitary piece of advice be?
I'm going to make it specific to the menstrual cycle and oral contraception, and I'm going to ask athletes and practitioners to begin to monitor their menstrual cycle, whether it be, as you said, a paper diary, an application on their phone, or an athlete management system. If it is just to say which day of the week you are on, I think that would be a huge step forward in them being able to predict their performance, their ability to adapt and how they feel in the future and what they might be able to get out of that. I guess, one thing I ask athletes is if the Olympic final, if you're going to make the Olympic final, do you know which day of your menstrual cycle that Olympic final is? And if they can't answer that question, they're not doing enough to monitor their menstrual cycle.
Yeah, wow. Powerful. Begin to monitor the cycle, whatever the mechanism. Clare, every guest of the show issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. So what is Clare Minahan's physical challenge of the week going to be?
Well, I've just signed up for the Overland Track in February, and so I've started to do a bit of hiking. And the closest hike to me is the Nerang State Forest, and you can do about 15 kilometres of some pretty nice trails in there. So I'd encourage everyone to get out to the Nerang State Forest and see just how beautiful a place so close to the Gold Coast can be.
Perfect. And if you're on the Gold Coast, avail yourself of the Nerang hills and dirt. It is certainly pretty. I've spent a bit of time in there myself. And if you are overseas in a state, Clare, I guess find the equivalent of something that's up and down in terrain.
Absolutely. Get out and hike, put 18 kilos on your back and see how that changes your performance.
Brilliant. And on performance, something has popped in, Clare, and I feel I must ask it. How does the female athlete triad affect performance? It seems like a logical sort of thing that it would, but how?
Yeah, there's acute changes in performance, but also those chronic changes in performance. And while we might not see a direct acute effect, we can sometimes, if energy is low, then particularly in endurance events, that may mean a change in energy availability, which might result in premature fatigue. Chronically, of course, it would affect the ability to adapt to certain training stimulus, again, related to energy availability and how we might not be able to reach certain intensities that we like to or durations during training simply because of a low energy availability. And that's not considering all the changes to health and the immune function that would also affect performance.
Clare Monahan, Associate Professor, PhD, Griffith University, Sports Physiology and Performance. Thank you. If we want to follow you and your outputs more, where can we find you, Clare? You're active on Twitter.
Absolutely, at Clare Minahan on Twitter. Of course, you can go to the Griffith University website, experts page.
Fantastic. Thank you, Clare, for your contribution to this show and also your ongoing work.
My absolute pleasure, and great to talk to you after all these years, Brad. Great to see what you've been up to as well.
Thanks, Claire. We did see each other running around the block recently, though.
We did.
Thanks, Claire.
Cheers.
So there you have it. Another expert edition of the Physical Performance Show. Now, as you've just learnt and heard, there was some key information that Claire shared today. If you know a female athlete in your world, or a coach or a health professional that would find today's share-ins helpful, then please, I implore you, share the episode with them. Also, please consider reaching out to Claire to let Claire know what it was that you enjoyed or learnt from today's episode. You'll find Claire over on Twitter at Clare Minahan. That's ClareMinahan. You can also jump over pogophysio.com.au and find all the handles over at the show notes. A big thank you for those leaving ratings and reviews for the Physical Performance Show over on iTunes. Aside from being a whole lot of fun to review, they also do help the show grow. A big thanks this week to show listener Ben Ludbrook. Ben rated the show 5 stars and commented, "Thank you for creating a huge bonus for the public by interviewing a remarkable number of many great athletes. Thank you for asking the athletes some great questions that I definitely learn a lot from. Thanks a lot for the enjoyable podcast with high quality episodes." Ben, thank you for taking the time to leave that review. Please also, if you are yet to, consider hitting subscribe. That is simply the best way for this show to increase in reach. And of course, feel free to take a podsy. That's a screenshot of the episode that you're enjoying and tagging in the show at Physical Performance Show or myself at Brad_beer over on Instagram. They are a whole lot of fun, so please keep them coming. A massive thanks, as always, to the very good folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin, all things show administration, Matthew Walding, all things show graphic design, and Oliver Crossley, assisting behind the scenes. Big thanks once again to PhysioCrem for your generous support of today's episode. Don't forget to take advantage of the PhysioCrem offer. Jump over to physiocrem.com.au to receive 20% off all PhysioCrem products. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we'll bring you the highs, lows and learnings of Australian track running sensation, national record holder for the 800 metres, Joseph Deng. It's a whole lot of fun. It's an episode not to be missed. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.